a silent symphony of terror. Cassian Virelli had spent his life commanding the kind of silence that made men tremble, but nothing prepared him for the silence he saw through a bus window on a rain-slicked Thursday night. Inside the 14 downtown bus, 5 young women sat like statues carved from grief. Their faces were a map of trauma, streaked with blood and dark, hollow bruising, their eyes fixed forward as if looking at anything else would cost them their lives. Then, a hand rose. Elena Sorrell pressed her palm against the cold glass, her thumb tucking in before her fingers curled tightly over it. Then another woman mirrored her, and another, until 5 trembling fists were pressed against the window in a desperate, silent plea the world was supposed to recognize. It meant help me. It meant I'm in danger. The bus had already rumbled through a dozen crowded Chicago blocks. Thousands of people had walked past. Hundreds of phones had remained tucked in pockets. No one noticed until a man looked down from a high-rise balcony and felt a rusted door in his chest wrench open for the first time in 12 years. Cassian stood up without a word, his expensive watch catching the dim light, because the last time he ignored a signal like that, a woman named Nina had died. Subscribe to this channel to keep getting beautiful stories like this. Nobody else at the table noticed the bus idling at the red light below. To them, it was just a Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, a city humming with the routine of honking taxis, pedestrians dodging puddles, and the low, metallic groan of the L train overhead. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and the metallic tang of coming rain. The terrace of the restaurant was packed. 3 Michelin stars and a 6-month wait list meant this balcony was reserved strictly for people who didn't believe in waiting for anything. Cassian Virelli was the king of those people. He sat at the far edge of the terrace, a glass of untouched bourbon sweating near his hand, seemingly listening to the men across from him argue over territorial logistics. He was 34, dark-haired, and possessed a stillness so absolute it made people either trust him completely or fear him instinctively. He wore a crisp white shirt, no tie, and an air of understated authority that didn't need a title to be felt. He owned nothing on paper, yet the men at his table had traveled thousands of miles just for the chance to sit in his presence. They were waiting for his blessing to move their product, but Cassian wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had drifted to the street, following an instinct he hadn't used in a decade. Below him, the bus hissed. Through the wide, illuminated windows, he saw the row of women. They weren't scrolling on phones or wearing earbuds. They sat rigid, shoulders pulled inward, their presence a jagged tear in the fabric of the city's routine. And then he saw him, Victor Havoc, the handler, sitting 1 row back with a predator's posture. Cassian's hand tightened around his glass. The game had changed. The rain began as a fine mist, blurring the neon edges of the Chicago skyline, but Cassian Virelli didn't blink. He remained anchored to the edge of the second-floor balcony, his silhouette a sharp, charcoal contrast against the warm, amber glow of the Belcourt dining room. Across the table, the 2 men from Detroit and New York were still talking, their voices a rhythmic drone about shipping lanes and maritime insurance. But to Cassian, they had become background noise, as insignificant as the hum of the L train overhead. His entire world had narrowed to the length of a city bus idling at the red light below. From this height, the 14 downtown bus looked like a lighted gallery of misery. Cassian's gaze, usually unreadable and still, traced the row of windows with a predator's focus. He saw them clearly now. 5 young women, their bodies pressed together not out of comfort, but out of a shared, rigid terror. They sat with their shoulders pulled inward, their spines straight and frozen, eyes locked on the backs of the seats in front of them as if the act of looking away might invite a strike. The unnaturalness of the scene hit him with the force of a physical blow. In a city of 8 million people, 5 women in their early 20s on a public bus should have been a cacophony of movement. There should have been the blue light of smartphone screens, the tangle of white earbud cords, or the rustle of shopping bags. Instead, there was only a haunting, statuesque stillness. One of them, a girl with dark hair and a blossoming bruise at her collarbone, Elena, shivered despite the warmth of the bus. Beside her, the youngest, Sable, sat with her bare feet tucked under the seat, her skin pale against the grimy floorboards. Cassian's hand, resting near his untouched bourbon, tightened until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just looking at the women anymore. He was looking at the shadow behind them. Victor Havoc sat one row back, his presence a dark weight that seemed to suck the air out of the vehicle. He wore a denim jacket stretched tight across heavy shoulders and a baseball cap pulled low, shading eyes that never stopped moving. He didn't sit like a passenger. He sat like a shepherd guarding a flock he intended to slaughter. Every time one of the women shifted, Havoc's posture sharpened, his hand twitching toward the heavy weight tucked into his waistband. It was a display of absolute control, a familiar and loathsome geometry of power that Cassian recognized in his marrow. It was the same suffocating atmosphere he had sensed 12 years ago outside a South Side nail salon. He remembered the girl, Nena, and the way her shoulders had braced when her owner stepped near her. He remembered telling himself then that it wasn't his business, that the city was full of tragedies he couldn't fix. He remembered the cold silence of the storage unit, where they eventually found her body. The light below turned green, but the bus didn't move yet. In that suspended second, Elena Sorrell turned her head just a fraction. Her eyes, wide and glassy with unshed tears, found Cassian on the balcony. She didn't scream. She didn't wave. She simply lifted her hand and pressed it flat against the glass. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing precision, she tucked her thumb into her palm and closed her fingers over it. The signal was a ghost from his past, a silent cry for help that he had spent over a decade trying to drown in bourbon and business. As the other 4 women followed suit, their hands rising in a trembling, synchronized plea, the untouched bourbon in Cassian's glass rippled. The man from Detroit was asking him a question about Great Lakes transit fees, but Cassian didn't hear him. The air around him seemed to hum with the electricity of a storm breaking. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy chair screeched against the stone terrace, a harsh, violent sound that cut through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. His associates fell silent, their faces masked with confusion, but Cassian was already moving. He didn't look back at the half-eaten dinner or the men who had flown 1,000 miles to see him. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone, his thumb already swiping across the screen to the one name that mattered in a crisis. As he hit the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the polished leather of his shoes slapping against the marble, he watched the red taillights of the bus begin to pull away into the Chicago gloom. The city continued its routine, the taxis honked, the rain began to fall in earnest, and hundreds of people kept their heads down. But Cassian Virelli was no longer a spectator. He was the hunter now, and for the first time in 12 years, the weight in his chest felt like a weapon instead of a stone. The drizzle turned into a steady wash against the glass, but the clarity of the horror remained sharp. Cassian Virelli did not move, his frame silhouetted against the opulent warmth of the Belcourt balcony, a man carved from the very shadows he commanded. Below, the bus groaned as its brakes hissed, a mechanical sigh that sounded to Cassian like a death rattle. His gaze was locked on the middle window, where 5 young women sat in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the glass. One of them, Elena Sorrell, leaned her forehead against the cold pane, her skin ghostly pale under the city's amber sodium lights. Her eyes were fixed on the restaurant's balcony, searching for a witness in a city of millions that had already looked away. Then the hand rose. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate motion, as if she were moving through deep water. Elena pressed her palm flat against the window, her fingers splayed for a fraction of a second before her thumb tucked inward, disappearing into the center of her hand. Then, with a trembling finality, she curled her 4 fingers over it, trapping the thumb beneath a fragile fist. The gesture was repeated. One by one, the other 4 women performed the same ritual, their eyes wide and glassy with a terror that bypassed the need for a scream. To the pedestrians on the sidewalk, it might have looked like 5 friends waving goodbye to the night. But Cassian felt a cold, familiar iron settle in his gut. He knew that signal. 2 years ago, in a windowless room in D.C., he had sat through a classified Department of Homeland Security briefing, a meeting he wasn't technically supposed to attend, but power has a way of opening doors that remain locked to the law. They had called it the Violence at Home Signal, an international distress code designed for the voiceless. It was a silent, "help me," meant for those who were being watched, those who couldn't call 911 without signing their own death warrants. Cassian's eyes shifted half an inch to the man sitting directly behind the women. Victor Havoc sat with a proprietary ease, his denim jacket stretched across shoulders that hadn't known an honest day's work in years. He wasn't checking his phone or looking at the street. He was watching the back of Elena's head with the predatory patience of a man who owned the air she breathed. Cassian saw the way Havoc's hand rested near his waistband, the posture of a handler who expected no resistance because he had already broken the spirit of his cargo. The light at the intersection flickered from red to green. The bus's engine roared, a guttural sound that vibrated through the stone of the balcony and up through Cassian's shoes. As the vehicle began to pull away, Elena's gaze didn't break. She stared at Cassian until the bus merged into the river of red taillights, her small, tucked fist remaining against the glass until the very last moment. The two men at the table were still talking, their voices a drone of percentages and shipping routes, completely oblivious to the fact that 5 lives had just been bartered for in silence right beneath them. Cassian stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the marble terrace was like a gunshot in the refined air of the restaurant. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't look at the Detroit broker or the man from New York. He was already reaching into his charcoal suit for his phone, his mind moving with a clinical, terrifying speed that had built his empire. 12 years ago, he had watched a woman named Nena walk into a situation just like this, and he had chosen the comfort of his own indifference. He had told himself it wasn't his business. 3 weeks later, he had stood over her body in a South Side morgue. As he hit the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, Cassian felt that old ghost finally step aside to make room for the man he was about to become. The bus was 73 North. He had 90 seconds to make sure it didn't disappear into the Chicago rain. Cassian stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the stone terrace, a harsh, jagged sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the restaurant. The logistics broker from Detroit stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as he looked up in confusion. Cassian didn't offer an apology or a backward glance. He was already walking toward the stairs, his mind shedding the business meeting as if it were a layer of dead skin. Behind him, the 2 men traded startled looks, but Cassian was already in the stairwell, his polished shoes slapping against the marble steps as he descended toward the street. He pulled his phone from his suit jacket before he even hit the sidewalk. The screen's glow was a cold blue against the darkening Chicago evening. He didn't scroll. He hit the speed dial for the one man who moved as fast as his own thoughts. The line connected in less than 2 seconds. "Raise," Cassian said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that brooked no greeting and no delay. "I need a vehicle on Michigan Avenue heading north. Now, you have 90 seconds. On the other end of the line, Ray's Calder didn't ask what was happening. He didn't ask about the meeting Cassian was supposed to be leading for the next 2 hours. Ray's had been with Cassian since they were teenagers, back when they were just 2 kids counting cash in the back of a Bridgeport dry cleaner. He knew the tone in Cassian's voice. It was the sound of a hunt beginning. "I've got a car 2 blocks east," Ray's replied, his voice a steady, clinical rasp. "Black Escalade. Ramos is behind the wheel. He's moving now." "Good," Cassian said, pushing through the restaurant's heavy front doors and stepping into the chilling night air. The rain was starting to fall in earnest now, turning the pavement into a mirror of neon and gray. "I need eyes on the 73 North bus, CTA route." "Already pulling the city traffic cams," Ray said, the faint clicking of a keyboard audible in the background. "I'm tracking every stop from Chinatown to the terminal. What am I looking for?" Cassian's eyes scanned the street, catching the flicker of red taillights as the bus merged into the heavy flow of traffic a block and a half away. 5 women, Cassian said, his jaw tightening as the image of the silent hand signals flashed in his mind. They're being moved. There's a handler in a denim jacket and a baseball cap sitting right behind them. I see it, Reyes muttered, his focus shifting as the live feed from the intersection of Michigan and Wacker bloomed on his monitors. They're sitting like statues. No phones, no bags. One of them, Cassian, one of them doesn't have shoes. I saw, Cassian replied, his voice dropping an octave. The detail of the barefoot girl, Sable, was a jagged glass shard in his memory. Do not lose that bus, Reyes. I want to know every passenger that gets on or off. If that handler moves, I want to know before his feet hit the pavement. A black Escalade swerved around a taxi and screeched to a halt at the curb beside Cassian. The rear door swung open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Cassian climbed in, the leather interior smelling of cold rain and ozone. Ramos, a stocky man with a shaved head and hands that looked like they had been forged in a shipyard, glanced into the rearview mirror. Stay 4 car lengths behind, Cassian ordered, his eyes already fixed on the rear window of the bus ahead. Keep us in the blind spot. If he thinks he's being followed, he'll spook. We wait for the transfer. Ramos nodded once and eased the Escalade into the lane, the heavy engine purring as they began the slow, methodical shadow of the 73 North. In the back seat, Cassian sat in a terrifyingly still posture, his hands pressed together in front of his face. Cassian, Reyes' voice came back through the car's speakers, sounding hollow and grim. I ran the handler's face through the database. He's been on this route 3 times in the last 2 weeks. He always gets off somewhere quiet past Foster. There's a white cargo van that meets him every time. The end of the line, Cassian whispered to himself, watching the raindrops streak across the tinted window like tears. He knew how this story ended if he didn't intervene. He had seen the ending 12 years ago with Nena, and he had spent every day since then carrying the weight of the silence he had chosen. Call Nora Whitfield, Cassian said, his voice regaining its surgical edge. Tell her we're going to need a recovery team and a safe house. And Reyes. Yeah. Bring the full team, Cassian said. No one walks away from this tonight. The hunt had moved beyond the balcony and into the dark, wet veins of the city. Cassian watched the bus turn onto Clark Street, the red lights ahead beckoning him into a confrontation that was 12 years overdue. The interior of the Escalade was a vacuum of expensive leather and filtered air, but for Cassian, the scent of the Chicago rain outside was being replaced by the stale, heavy odor of a South Side nail salon from a decade ago. As the bus ahead flickered through the neon shadows of Clark Street, the present dissolved into the sharp, jagged edges of 2014. Back then, Cassian was 22, a man still learning the weight of his father's name and the cold mechanics of the city's underbelly. He remembered the humidity of that August, the kind that made the air feel like a wet wool blanket, and he remembered Nena. She had worked at a salon just 2 blocks from one of the Virelli warehouses. Nena was a ghost in plain sight, a quiet woman who always looked as though she were carrying a weight no one else could see. Even in the sweltering heat of a Chicago summer, she wore long sleeves, her eyes perpetually downcast, her movements small and apologetic. One of Cassian's associates had mentioned her offhand, noting how she flinched whenever the salon owner walked past her station, how she never left the building alone, and how the light in her eyes seemed to have been extinguished long ago. Cassian had seen it once himself. He had been walking to a meeting, his mind full of numbers and territory, when he glanced through the plate glass window of the salon. He saw Nena bent over a customer's hand, her shoulders hiked up toward her ears in a posture of permanent bracing. The owner was standing directly behind her, leaning in to whisper something into her ear that made her entire body go rigid. It was a tableau of absolute control, a silent cry for help that didn't need a single word. In that moment, Something in Cassian had whispered to look closer, to stop walking, to demand a name and a reason. But he was young, and he was ambitious, and he had convinced himself that the girl's suffering wasn't his business. He told himself that someone else would notice, that she would eventually be fine, and that he had more important things to do than interfere in the management of a storefront he didn't own. He had looked away, and in looking away, he had signed her death warrant. 3 weeks later, the silence he had allowed was broken by the news of a discovery in a South Side storage unit. Nina had been found there, discarded like a piece of broken furniture, her body having finally given out after 4 days of dehydration and beatings. She had tried to run, making it only 2 blocks before they caught her and locked her away as a warning to the others. The salon had been nothing more than a front for a trafficking ring that forced women into 18-hour days of labor and a lifetime of fear. The owner, a man who had smiled at his customers and maintained a 4-star reputation on the internet, was the architect of her misery. He was the one who had whispered in her ear while Cassian watched from the sidewalk. Cassian had never forgotten the image of her face in the morgue, not because he had known her, but because he realized he was the one who could have prevented her from ever ending up there. He had held the power to change her ending, and he had chosen the comfort of his own ignorance. That failure had become the foundation of the man he was now. He had sworn on every drop of blood in his veins that he would never look away again. He had spent 11 years anonymously funding safe houses and trauma centers like Nora Whitfield's Threshold, trying to pay a debt to a woman who could no longer collect it. The Escalade hit a pothole, jarring Cassian back into the present. The 73 North bus was still in front of them, its red taillights bleeding into the wet pavement like open wounds. Through the rear window of the bus, he saw Elena's head tilt slightly, and the memory of Nina's frozen shoulders merged with the sight of the 5 women currently trapped in that rolling cage. "They're turning on Clark," Ramos said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the car. Cassian's hand tightened on the armrest, his jaw set in a line of hardened steel. He wasn't that 22-year-old boy anymore. He was the man who had built an empire so he would never have to feel that kind of helplessness again. He looked at the bus, and he didn't see a business problem or a logistical hurdle. He saw 5 lives that were not going to end in a storage unit. "Don't lose them," Cassian said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "I'm not letting a ghost win twice." The black Escalade glided through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like a phantom, its engine a low, predatory hum that felt in sync with the heavy rhythm of Cassian's heart. Up ahead, the 73 North bus was a glowing capsule of misery, cutting through the neon haze of the city. Ramos kept the vehicle exactly 4 car lengths back, a distance calculated to remain invisible in a rearview mirror yet close enough to strike. They were ghosting a rolling prison, and the air inside the Escalade was thick with the clinical intensity of a tactical operation. On the center console, a tablet glowed with a grid of live camera feeds. Ray's voice drifted through the speakers, calm and detached, yet laced with the urgency of a man who knew the stakes were measured in minutes. "Crossing Lawrence now," Ray's reported. "I've hacked the municipal traffic grid. I have them on 3 different angles. The bus is running 5 minutes behind schedule. Havoc probably made the driver slow down to avoid a premature arrival at the transfer point." Cassian leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the rear window of the bus. From this angle, he could see the silhouette of the handler's baseball cap. Victor Havoc hadn't moved. He was a dark, unyielding shape behind the girls, a constant reminder of the leash he held. Every few seconds, the bus would hit a pothole or lurch at a stoplight, and Cassian would see the women's heads bob in unison, fragile, exhausted, and utterly broken. Ray's look at the girl in the 3rd window. "Elena," Cassian said, his voice a low vibration. "Is she still conscious?" There was a brief pause, the sound of keys clacking as Ray's zoomed in on a high-definition feed from a streetlight at the next intersection. "She's awake, Cassian, but she's fatting. Her pupils are blown and she's shivering. Based on the way she's holding her arm, I'd bet on a hairline fracture or internal bruising. She's been the shield for the others. She's the one who's been taking the hits. Cassian felt a flare of white-hot rage, but he forced it down into the cold, dark place where he kept his resolve. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Precision was the only thing that would save them. Where are they heading? This isn't a standard stop pattern. You're right, Reyes confirmed. They're bypassing the Foster Avenue terminal. Havoc just stood up. He's leaning over the driver. My guess. They're forcing an unscheduled stop in the industrial corridor near the canal. It's a dead zone, no foot traffic, no witnesses, and plenty of places to hide a van. The bus veered left, turning off the main artery and into a neighborhood where the streetlights were sparse, and the warehouses loomed like giant, tomb-like structures. The vibrant life of downtown Chicago was gone, replaced by the grim reality of the city's forgotten edges. Here, the rain felt colder, the shadows deeper. Ramos, lights off, Cassian ordered. The Escalade went dark, its silhouette blending into the gloom of the industrial park. They trailed the bus through a labyrinth of chain-link fences and rusted loading docks. The only light came from the bus's interior, casting a flickering yellow glow onto the wet pavement. I see the meat, Reyes' voice whispered through the car. North end of the lot behind the old meat-packing plant. White cargo van, no plates. 2 men standing outside. One's got a thermal blanket, the other's holding a zip-tie gun. This is a high-volume transfer, Cassian. They aren't just moving these 5. They're consolidating. Cassian watched as the bus began to slow, its air brakes hissing one last time in the middle of a desolate gravel lot. The doors creaked open. In the dim light, he saw Victor Havoc stand up and roughly grab Elena by the shoulder, hauling her toward the exit. The other 4 women followed, stumbling in their haste to avoid his grip, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. They're moving, Cassian said, his hand reaching for the door handle. His knuckles were white, his frame coiled like a spring. Reyes, tell the team to move to phase 2. No sirens, no shouting. We close the perimeter before they even know the air has changed. Team is in position, Reyes replied, his voice hardening. Ramos on my mark, 3, 2, 1, go. The Escalade surged forward, its tires spitting gravel as it tore through the darkness. Cassian watched the white van's doors swing open, a dark, cavernous mouth waiting to swallow the women whole. He thought of Nena of the storage unit, and of the 12 years he had spent waiting for this exact moment of redemption. As the car slid into a perfect broadside block, cutting off the van's only exit, Cassian didn't feel fear. He felt a terrifying, absolute clarity. The bus was empty, the transfer was happening, and for the men in that lot, the world was about to end. The industrial corridor of the near north side was a graveyard of brick and rusted iron, a place where the city's heartbeat slowed to a jagged mechanical throb. The 73 North bus, far from its usual route and well past its scheduled stops, lurched to a halt under a flickering streetlight that hissed with the dampness of the evening. There was no bus stop here, no benches for commuters, and no witnesses, only the looming silhouettes of salt domes and abandoned meat-packing plants. The air brakes exhaled a long, mournful shriek that echoed off the corrugated metal fences, signaling the end of the journey for the 5 women inside. Victor Havoc stood up before the bus had even fully settled. His movements were abrupt, devoid of the earlier predatory patience, replaced now by the frantic efficiency of a man who knew he was operating in the cracks of the world. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He reached down and gripped Elena's shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of her shirt with a force that made her gasp. He hauled her upward, and the movement was a signal for the others. Myria and Leora rose instantly, their bodies acting as a shield for Danica and the barefoot Sable, who was trembling so violently the metal floorboards seemed to vibrate beneath her. Move, Havoc growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the idling engine. The driver, a man whose eyes remained fixed straight ahead, as if he were a ghost behind the wheel, hit the lever for the center doors. They creaked open, admitting a gust of wind that smelled of wet asphalt and river rot. Havoc shoved Elena toward the exit. She stumbled, her knees hitting the steps, but Myria caught her, pulling her upright with a strength born of desperation. They moved in a jagged, terrified line, a procession of shadows descending into the darkness of the gravel lot. Waiting in the center of the clearing was the white cargo van. It sat with its engine running, the exhaust plumes curling upward like white ghosts in the rain. The side door was already slid back, revealing a cavernous, windowless interior lined with gray padding. Two men stood by the open door, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. One held a roll of heavy-duty zip ties, the other checked a handheld manifest, his disinterest more chilling than Havoc's aggression. To them, the five women weren't human beings with names and histories. They were units of inventory to be processed before the sun rose. Sable, the youngest, hesitated at the base of the bus steps. Her bare feet touched the cold, sharp gravel, and she let out a small, broken whimper. The sound was tiny, but in the dead silence of the industrial lot, it sounded like a scream. Havoc didn't hesitate. He stepped down behind her and delivered a sharp shove to the small of her back. "I said move, brat," he snapped. Elena turned, her eyes flashing with a final, flickering spark of defiance. She reached back for Sable's hand, locking their fingers together. She looked around the desolate lot, searching for the man on the balcony, searching for the black Escalade she had seen in the reflection of the bus windows blocks ago. But the lot was dark. The only light came from the van's interior and the dying orange glow of the single streetlight. For a heartbeat, the crushing weight of reality settled over her. The realization that they were truly alone, that the signal had been sent into a void, and that the padded darkness of the van was their final destination. They were marched toward the van's open door, their footsteps crunching rhythmically on the gravel. The man with the zip ties stepped forward, reaching for Elena's wrists. She didn't fight him. She was looking at Sable, trying to offer a smile that wouldn't form. Behind them, Havoc pulled a cigarette from his pocket and struck a match, the tiny flame illuminating the cruel lines of his face for a fleeting second. He looked satisfied, the look of a man who had successfully moved his product from one cage to another without incident. The lead man grabbed Elena's arm to hoist her into the back of the van. The metal floor of the vehicle was cold and smelled of bleach and old sweat. One by one, they were being erased. Danica was already inside, huddled in the far corner, her eyes fixed on the door as it prepared to close and lock them away forever. But as Havoc moved to shove the last of them, Sable, into the dark, the air in the lot suddenly changed. The low, distant hum of the city was abruptly cut by a sound that didn't belong, the high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine approaching from the shadows of the packing plant, accompanied by the sudden, blinding flash of high-beam LEDs. The light hit the white van with the intensity of a spotlight, washing out the shadows and freezing the traffickers in place. The man with the zip ties dropped the roll, the plastic clattering against the gravel. Havoc squinted into the glare, his hand going instinctively to the heavy weight at his hip, but he was already too late. The silence of the industrial park was shattered not by a siren, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of car doors opening in perfect unison. From the darkness beyond the light, the silhouette of a man emerged. He moved with a terrifying, calculated stillness, his charcoal suit absorbing the glare of the headlamps. Cassian Virelli stepped into the light, his eyes fixed on Havoc with a focus so lethal it felt like a physical weight. Behind him, Reyes and the others fanned out, a wall of black-clad shadows that swallowed the lot's exits before the traffickers could even draw breath. The transfer had stopped. The door to the van was still open, but the world outside it had just become a much more dangerous place for the men standing in the gravel. The high-beam LEDs of the Escalade didn't just illuminate the lot. They cut through the rain like a physical weight, pinning the white cargo van against the rusted backdrop of the meat-packing plant. Before the echoes of the tires on gravel had even faded, two more black SUVs surged from the shadows of the neighboring warehouse, slewing into position with a synchronized, heavy grace. They formed a perfect, interlocking triangle of reinforced steel, boxing the van in so tightly that its front bumper was inches from a brick wall, and its rear was sealed by 3 tons of bulletproof American engineering. The silence that followed was more terrifying than a siren. Cassian's men didn't shout orders. They didn't scream for anyone to put their hands up. They emerged from the vehicles in a coordinated wave of black tactical gear and professional focus, a wall of black that moved with the fluid, predatory intent of a single organism. Ray's Calder stepped out from the passenger side of the lead vehicle, his frame silhouetted against the glare, his eyes already scanning the perimeter for secondary threats. To his left and right, 4 other men fanned out, their movements clinical and silent, their boots crunching on the wet gravel in a rhythmic, unsettling cadence. Victor Havoc froze, his hand hovering near the small of his back where his weapon was tucked. He looked at the wall of men closing in and realized, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he wasn't dealing with the police. There were no flashing blue lights, no megaphones, no negotiations. There was only the cold, hard reality of an apex predator reclaiming its territory. The man with the zip ties backed away from Elena, his hands rising instinctively, his face pale and slick with rain. He looked at Ray's, then at the silent figures moving toward the driver's side of the van, and his knees seemed to buckle. He knew the difference between a badge and a shadow, and the shadows were currently closing every exit he had left. Cassian stepped forward, his charcoal suit absorbing the light of the headlamps, making him look like a dark tear in the fabric of the evening. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. His power was in the way he occupied the space, a man who had built an empire on the understanding that true violence is often unnecessary if the threat is absolute. He stopped 6 feet from Havoc, his gaze shifting briefly to the van's open door. Inside the padded darkness, Elena, Myria, and the others were huddled together, their eyes wide and reflecting the harsh LED glare. They looked like ghosts caught in a searchlight. Sable was still shivering, her bare feet tucked under her as she clung to Elena's waist. For them, the arrival of these dark men was a new kind of terror, a shift from one nightmare into an unknown, silent void. "Step away from the girls," Cassian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the drumming of the rain with a lethal, vibrating clarity. It wasn't a request. It was an observation of a fact that had already been decided. Havoc's fingers twitched. "You don't know who you're messing with, pal," he rasped, his bravado a thin, shaking veil over his panic. "This is Lake Line business. We have." "You have nothing," Ray's interrupted, his voice a low, sandpaper growl as he moved into Havoc's peripheral vision. "You have no transit codes, no backup, and as of 3 minutes ago, the offshore account you use for Lake Line movers has a balance of 0. You're standing in a dead lot, Gregor, and you're running out of air." The use of his real name hit Havoc like a physical blow. He looked at Cassian, really looked at him, and saw the cold, deep-seated recognition in the boss's eyes. This wasn't a random intervention. This was a reckoning. Behind them, 2 of Cassian's men reached the van's cab. They didn't struggle with the driver. They simply shattered the window with a glass breaker, pulled the man through the frame, and had him zip-tied on the gravel before he could even let out a breath. The efficiency was terrifying. It was a surgical removal of every variable, every escape route, and every ounce of hope the traffickers had left. The wall of black narrowed the circle. The men in tactical gear stood like statues, their weapons held at a low ready, their eyes never blinking. They were the perimeter, the judge, and the jury. The industrial lot, once a place where women were traded like cargo, had been transformed into a courtroom where the sentence was about to be carried out in the rain. Cassian took 1 step closer to Havoc, his shadow falling over the smaller man. The smell of wet asphalt and ozone was sharp in the air. 12 years, Cassian whispered, his voice for Havoc's ears alone. "I've been waiting 12 years to see a face like yours in a place like this." The silence returned, heavier now, as the last of the traffickers, resistance evaporated under the weight of the wall of black. The girls watched from the van, their breath hitching in their throats, realizing that for the first time in their lives, the men standing in front of them weren't looking at them as product. They were looking at the men holding the leashes as targets. The rain intensified, turning the gravel lot into a shimmering, dark stage, but Cassian Virelli didn't move to shield himself. He stood 3 feet from Victor Havoc, his presence so commanding that the larger man seemed to shrink within his denim jacket. The silence of the industrial corridor was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of water against the roof of the white van and the soft, terrified breathing of the women huddled inside. Cassian's eyes remained fixed on Havoc's face, a face he had already dismantled in his mind long before the Escalade's tires had touched this gravel. "You're wondering how this ends, Victor," Cassian said, his voice a low, clinical vibration that cut through the damp air. It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of a dissection. Havoc tried to find his voice, his hand still hovering near the weapon at his hip, but the sight of Ray's Calder standing perfectly still in his peripheral vision made his fingers twitch with indecision. "You're making a mistake," Havoc rasped, the bravado in his voice sounding like dry leaves on pavement. "This is a private transport. You've got no right to." "Line Movers LLC," Cassian interrupted, the name falling from his lips with the cold weight of a tombstone. "Registered to a shell corporation in Delaware. 3 primary accounts at a regional bank in Milwaukee, all of which were frozen 45 minutes ago. You use the 73 North route because the driver, Miller, owes your boss $40,000 in gambling debts. You pick up at the terminal, you transfer here, and you head to the warehouse on 42nd Street. Am I missing anything?" The color drained from Havoc's face, leaving it a sickly, translucent gray under the LED glare. The surgical wall of information Cassian had built around him was more suffocating than any physical cage. Havoc looked at the men in black tactical gear, then back at Cassian, realizing that the man standing before him didn't just have guns. He had the blueprint to Havoc's entire existence. "How?" Havoc whispered, the word escaping him like a leak in a pressurized tank. "Because you were loud, Victor," Cassian replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You thought because these women were silent, the world was deaf. You thought because they were invisible to the people on the street, no one was watching. But I was watching." Cassian leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the man who had spent the last several hours terrorizing 5 innocent lives. 12 years ago, I met a man like you. He had the same smell of cheap cigarettes and unearned power. He thought he was untouchable, too. He was wrong. And tonight, you're the one who's out of time." Behind them, Ray stepped forward, his hand out. One of the other team members handed him a tablet. "The FBI field office has the manifest, Cassian," Ray's reported, his voice flat and professional. "They've already raided the 42nd Street location. They're picking up your boss, Vanek, as we speak." He started talking before they even got the zip ties on him. The mention of his employer was the final blow. Havoc's knees buckled, his hand falling away from his waistband. He looked at the van, where Elena was still watching them, her small fist finally beginning to unclasp from the distress signal she had held for miles. The power dynamic had inverted so violently that Havoc looked less like a predator and more like a cornered rat realizing the trap had been set days ago. "The police will be here in 8 minutes, Cassian said, checking his watch with the indifference of a man nodding a weather change. "I've already provided them with the dashcam footage from the bus and the GPS logs from your van. You won't be going to a local precinct, Victor. You're going to a federal holding cell. And because I've made it my business to ensure every witness is protected, you're never going to see the sun from the outside of a fence again." Cassian turned his back on Havoc, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked toward the open door of the van, his expression softening as he looked at the 5 women. The harshness of the Mafia Boss, the man who had just dismantled a criminal enterprise with a few sentences, vanished. In its place was a man who had finally silenced a ghost. Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the charcoal suit, the expensive watch, and the lethal grace of a man who moved in a world of violence. But she also saw the man who had looked down from a balcony and chosen not to turn away. "It's over," Cassian said to her, his voice reaching into the padded darkness of the van. "No one is taking you anywhere you don't want to go. My name is Cassian, and you're safe now." As the distant wail of sirens began to rise over the sound of the Chicago rain, Cassian reached out a hand, not to grab but to offer. Elena took it, her fingers cold and trembling, but as she stepped out of the van and onto the gravel, she didn't look back. The surgical strike was complete. The empire of silence had been broken, and for the first time in 12 years, Cassian Virelli could breathe the cold, wet air without the taste of regret. The distant wail of sirens began as a low hum, a sharp contrast to the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the van's roof. For 12 years, the city of Chicago had sounded like a collection of missed opportunities to Cassian Virelli, but tonight, the noise felt like a resolution. From the shadows of the packing plant, a silver SUV pulled into the lot, stopping well short of the tactical perimeter. A woman stepped out, her movements steady and calm amidst the chaos of zip-tied men and idling engines. Nora Whitfield didn't wear a uniform. She wore a heavy wool coat and a look of fierce, quiet compassion. She was the director of Threshold, a woman who specialized in the delicate art of putting broken worlds back together. Cassian met her halfway. They didn't shake hands. Their relationship was built on a foundation of silent checks and ledger entries that never appeared in public records. 5 of them, Cassian said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "One is injured, a girl named Elena. She was the one who signaled. There's a younger one, Sable. She's barefoot. They've been through a transfer cycle, but they didn't reach the warehouse." Nora nodded, her eyes shifting to the open door of the van where the women were still huddled, watching the flickering blue and red lights of the approaching police cruisers. "I have a team at the safe house ready," she said. "Medical, trauma counselors, and legal. They'll be off the grid before the paperwork even hits the precinct." Cassian watched as Nora approached the van. She didn't rush. She stopped a few feet away, lowering her height to be less intimidating, speaking in a voice that was a soft anchor in the storm. One by one, the women began to move. Myria stepped out first, her posture still protective, followed by Leora and Danica. When Elena stepped onto the gravel, she paused, her eyes searching the darkness until they found Cassian. He didn't move toward her. He knew that for someone like Elena, a man in a suit stood for a world that had failed her for far too long. Instead, he simply gave a single, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bravery it took to press a hand against a glass window when the world was looking the other way. "Cassian," Reyes said, stepping up beside him as the first police car turned into the lot. "Federal agents are 3 minutes out. We should go." Cassian didn't look at the police. He looked at the white van, now empty, its doors swinging aimlessly in the wind. He looked at the gravel where Victor Havoc lay face down, stripped of his power and his secrets. Finally, he looked at the silver SUV as it pulled away, carrying 5 lives toward a future that was no longer a foregone conclusion. He climbed back into the Escalade, the leather interior still smelling of wood smoke and rain. As Ramos eased the vehicle out of the industrial park, passing the line of squad cars with their sirens screaming, Cassian reached for his glass of bourbon. It was watered down now, the ice long since melted, but as he took a sip, the coldness didn't bite. For the first time in 12 years, the ghost of Nena wasn't sitting in the seat beside him. The debt wasn't fully paid, it never would be, but the ledger was finally moving in the right direction. "Where to, boss?" Ramos asked, his eyes on the rearview mirror. Cassian looked out at the city, the skyline glowing with 1,000 indifferent lights. "Home, Ramos," he said, his voice finally reclaiming its absolute, quiet stillness. "The hunt is over for tonight." The black Escalade merged into the traffic on Lake Shore Drive, becoming just another shadow in a city of millions. driven by a man who had finally learned that the most powerful thing he could do with his empire was to listen to the things that were never said.